From San Antonio, Texas, home of the Alamo, the Riverwalk, and the World Heritage San Antonio Missions, this is the Exit Planning Coach podcast with John F. Dini. Designed to help advisors who work with business owners, John talks with top professionals in the exit planning field about best practices, marketing tips, and how to be more effective when working with owners. Now, here's John F. Dini.
Welcome to the Exit Planning Coach podcast. My guest today is T. Phillips, who is a certified family business specialist and investment advisor. T. is originally from Oklahoma, and the family's roots go back to 1889. This is kind of neat. They had Dawson Produce, which grew into a tri-state operator. However, and we're going to talk about this, obviously, T. The business could not withstand a transition of ownership. So in 1998, T. opened Family Business Legacies in Indianapolis. You've always been in Indianapolis, right, T.
Professionally, yep.
Professionally, okay. Yep. Where he completed the Certified Family Business Specialist, CFBS, through the American College in Pennsylvania. And he also holds the Accredited Estate Planner designation and the Chartered Financial Consultant designation. He specializes in business continuation and owner exit objectives. And on most weekends, he can be found watching the Sooners. So Indianapolis didn't wear off that much on you.
No, Sooner born and sooner bred. If anybody knows the fight song, it's that's the Oklahoma chant.
And the Chicago Cubs, how did that happen?
Again, growing up, it's you just get it was the Dodgers and the Cubs growing up. So, but my long love is obviously shifted to the Cubs, and it was also where my wife and I formally started dating. Right, was at a Cubs game, right? And invited by her father. So there's some connections, long time.
I took my dad to a Cubs game once. And we were fortunate enough to still see Harry Carey lead, take me out to the ball game.
I have seen several of those, and they're wonderful memories, right?
Yeah.
So, and it is amazing they have yet to find anybody who actually can get anywhere close to how good he was at that whole take me out to the ball game.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody can do it.
Yeah. Have they put glass up on the booth yet? Or can you still hang out over the booth like Harry did?
I think, you can still hang out, but I don't know I think that's like a separate booth, right? So it must be like Harry's chair that's retired, right? No one's going to sit in that chair ever. So that's just where the singers come out and can lean out, but then the broadcasters are somewhere else. So
let's start out with the story.
Sure.
Why did Dawson Produce not make the transition?
Well, you only have 20 minutes to have this discussion, is that right?
Well, we've been known to go long.
And I use this story a lot, and that's intentionally meant for me to make a connection. I'm going to call it with the audience, whomever that audience is. And so even as it relates to this advisory side, there's some things that say, well, what's the one thing an advisor should be doing in this besides the knowledge of exit planning? Is you better have a story, right? How do you connect with them in that aspect? But the story that goes on with my family's business is, my great-great-grandfather started Dawson Produce during the land run, right? He was a school teacher in Missouri. And he knew that as people were coming down to Oklahoma to settle, they said they're going to need food, fresh food, right? And so he figured out refrigerator boxcars and other stuff to kind of make this into what became a three-state operation. If you think about it, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to grow into a multi-state operation with hardly any infrastructure is not an easy thing to do, especially dealing with fruits and vegetables. But the challenge is, the terminology I always use is, the history will always repeat itself until we choose to learn from it. And so that what my great-great-grandfather had done was thinking he's going to keep his sons in the business by giving them stock, right? He's going to incentivize them to give them stock, but he did not put on any restrictive covenants to that stock. And so two of the three, had a much more interest in going into the oil and gas industry, because that was obviously very popular back then and still continues to this day. And so they sold their stock to find their capital to a competitor, and they went on to the oil and gas business, right? Well, that effectively killed the company, right? Killed the produce company, didn't exist anymore. Everything was shut down and blah, 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 all that type of stuff. Horrible. But what's worse is that for 80 years, 2 branches of the family tree never spoke again.
Ooh.
And it was a total accident that my mother, this was right as I was getting into this industry, as my mother found the relative of the other side of the family and learned all of this story. So why I do it, why I use and reference the story quite often is because I've seen it firsthand. I've seen the impact financially. I've seen the impact emotionally. I've seen the fact that it's multi-generational. And yet what happens today, and has happened my entire almost 30-year career doing this, is that owners are often making the same mistakes that my family did almost 100 years ago and families have been doing for centuries, right? So that's kind of the story behind it.
Oh. Yeah, that's similar to the situations we've all run into where
Sure.
children inside and outside the business are going to be given equal shares.
Yep.
And my tagline that I always throw out to whichever part of the couple, but it's usually the mom, has decided that would be the fair distribution is, are you planning for them to have Thanksgiving after you leave? Or, because it'll kill that off.
Well, it generally will, right? Especially if it's not thought right now. Here's another fun story within all that. You mentioned the mom and whatever. We always oftentimes refer to, especially the matriarch of the family, whether they own and operate the business or they don't. And I think in what you're referring to is the times when they're not. We
Right.
call them the CEOs, right? The moms were the CEOs, the chief emotional officer of the whole operation, the whole family. And so it's very important I think they gain as much benefit from all of the elements of exit planning if we focus on them, because those things will continue to happen. This whole fair is equal type of mentality.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, that certainly explains your interest and explains how you got started in this. You've been doing it for 30 years. And as a CFBS, do you typically search out family businesses or specialize in family businesses, or are they just as they come as the normal percentage of business ownership?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, but I would say it's almost impossible for a business, and we all know, we can all rattle off the number of publicly traded businesses that are still family owned, family controlled, and so forth. But most businesses have the dynamics, even if there's not any siblings or children or cousins in the business other than the owner, they have the dynamics of family business.
Sure.
And so, but as it relates to, I think, your question, I have chosen to very specifically work with a certain revenue size of companies, a certain set of industries of companies, and therefore almost always in those cases, I'm dealing with some level of family-owned business dynamic involved with that. So that range for me, I'm gonna call it my sweet spot, is $7 to $18 million of revenue. That's where I love to play. My range is maybe 5 to 50. Got a couple of clients that are above 50 million, but there's not a need for it, right? There's 37 million companies out there. I think the last statistic that I just learned, that based on tax returns, that are over 5 employees but less than 250. Well, that's a lot of businesses out there, right? So I'm trying to very narrow focus my niche into that revenue range: construction, manufacturing, distribution, and agriculture. Again, intentionally trying to focus in that aspect, and that the one or at the most 3 owners have the controlling structure of the business, whether they're related or not. I'm generally not going after the 5, 6, 10, 15 owner business. That's not where I spend my time.
Yeah.
And then that size, they're not going to be that way, but it's going to be generally under 3 owners.
I can't imagine having more than 3 owners. What's the most? I'm dealing with a family business now that it's 4th generation or 4th generation. And and there's a couple others I've dealt with where it's been dispersed through non-working family. And the current CEO has cousins that are shareholders that have never seen the operation, have no idea how they make money. All they know is at the end of the year, what's my cut?
Yep. I have actually several of those, and some actually can be very successful, but that may be beyond even the scope of this conversation today. But the aspect is that requires a very, very intentional focus on governance and structure and the purposes. I'm going to call it a profit distribution plan, so that there's less of the expectation of a dividend. Hey, what's my cut? Versus, hey, we don't have an enterprise, nobody gets anything, right? So therefore, how do we make the business win? But again, it's rare, it's hard to do. But the ones that do it successfully can last for generations. And even with many, and then obviously when you're the fourth or fifth or sixth and it's stayed in the family, you're going to have a lot of non-working shareholders. You just have different structures.
Yeah, I had another client some years ago, same situation, fourth generation family, and their annual shareholders meeting, he said, was when he got to run a semi-public company, because it was the only time and this was even before video participation, it was the only time everybody showed up on the campus of the business and looked around and said, yeah, good business you got here. How much?
Right. Yep. No, I get it. Yeah. What's interesting is some of those same dynamics, right? You said it was the multiple generation and the kids never been around or the family around. Again, the same dynamics can apply, obviously different scale, but it can be just as damaging in the smaller, even the first generation business, or what is the next generation expectations, right? So crops up early and then embeds itself.
Describe your first meeting to me. Somebody calls you. Is it and okay, we've got multiple owners in a family business. Do they all decide? What is typical? Do they all decide to call you, or does one of them call you and say, I want to talk about this, and the rest of them are clueless? Or how do you usually start out?
That's a great question. I would generally say, if I'm going back and reflecting on all the different types of meetings I had over the years, there generally is a lead, right? Some one person, if you will, that within the family is involved in, kind of running with this, and a lot of times that's because they have either the most at risk or they're the most in tune with the whole operation. They recognize the magnitude of it, but obviously they're kind of given the lead. But if it is where there are multiple owners, my first meeting oftentimes is intended to be with as many of them as possible, right, in the same room, only because I know that that a decision in one area will have effect on the other. So
Sure.
We might as well go ahead and come in to see, all right, let's understand your situation. Let's talk about it. I'm not trying to provide solutions at that point, but let's get to understand it. And then I want to figure out to what extent are they really wanting to have advice, not just the person that called me, but the others that are involved. Who are the folks who are going to have some significant influence, even if they have no vote, right? If they have some sort of significant influence or impact, because the other side of the equation is these things are not only so emotionally charged, not just like what I talked about in my own family's business, and so financially important to many, many parties and stakeholders, not just stockholders.
Right.
That if they don't like me, it doesn't matter how smart I am. If they don't like me, I'm the wrong person, right?
Right.
I think that's the reason there's such a good proliferation of the exit planning industry and those that are becoming very skilled at this space, is because really I think the relationship should drive that. Obviously, we should anticipate the advisor is a smart one, right, and has the proper training. But once that's aside, is whom do we really get along with, that we're comfortable doing things that are going to be very vulnerable, right? We're going to ask questions that most have never asked, most have never thought they had permission to ask, and if they're not comfortable going through all of that, then it's likely not the right fit. So again, it's not a total answering your question as far as what's the first meeting like, but I'm trying to determine if we're going to have call it a 45-minute, 65-minute discussion. Generally face-to-face. I would prefer not to do Zoom as our first meeting, again, absent circumstances. Again, even separate from COVID, right? There's something about an eyeball to eyeball across the table, and candidly to me, it's in their space, right? Where is their business? It's me going to them. Again, this is my style. It doesn't make it right. It's what I've always chosen to do. I haven't made a better connection, because then I can get to understand what's going on with them, right? Because everything that's important to them is probably on their wall. And so I'm going to go into their space to understand them and to see, do they trust, what do they trust about me? How do we develop that sort of a conversation? And no meeting, that first meeting, there's nothing, I actually don't even sell that first meeting. I don't get an engagement signed that first meeting. There's no intent for that first meeting. The only purpose of that meeting is to say, should we have any reason to have another meeting, of where we dive in a lot deeper about certain elements, right? And so I'll end up spending, again, my style only, is I'll spend an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, and sometimes that meeting goes nowhere. They're not ready. I determine they're not ready. They determine themselves are not ready, and we part, but comes back later, or maybe never again. But the rest of them is like, yeah, I really like what we're talking about here. Let's go ahead. What's our next structure? They're generally getting to the point they're asking me, T. Ray, what's next? Then I'm able to lay out, all right, here's what we do. Here's what we will need to do next. Here's even your homework, right, that we'll want to accomplish. And in part of that homework, if you will, no matter what it is, whether it's the ExitMap assessment, or it doesn't really matter where we start, if they're not willing to do that homework, that's an indication they're not ready for it, period.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the stuff on the wall. I recall some years back, I got a very favorable treatment from a county appraisal district employee on my appeal of their assessment, because I walked in and I looked on his wall, and he had a golf trophy plaque on his wall. And after 15 minutes of talking about his golfing prowess, he pretty much just signed off on my appeal.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's really the way it kind of should be. It's like it's almost like they're saying, all right, I know we were here for some business reason. Should we get to it, if you will, right? Meaning it's not me asking that, it's the client's getting to that point, and that's that benefit of that trust in that relationship. That's probably the most important.
Yeah, good tip. Good tip. Let me take a break here to pay for the podcast, and then we'll be back in 60 seconds and start again.
How would your practice survive if only 25% of your clients were happy with your work? How many referrals would you get? Would you advertise that success rate? Over the last decade, both the Exit Planning Institute and PwC have surveyed owners and found that 75% were profoundly unhappy a year after their exits. In 10 years, the exit planning industry has done little to fix this issue. Business owners need purpose, direction, and activity after exiting. Planning for that starts with your very first coaching conversation. We work with advisors who believe that clients should be happy after exiting. ExitMap is a structured discovery process that helps you have deeper conversations about client options, objectives, and life after the business. We help you launch better transitions. Take a test drive at exitmap.com.
Welcome back to the Exit Planning Coach podcast. My guest today is T. Ray Phillips from Family Business Legacies in Indianapolis. And you are a specialist, T. Ray, and you do a lot of family business. And as you know, and we all say, that this process takes a team. So although clearly we'll have your contact information up when we post the podcast, we also might have people listening in the car. Why don't you give us your website and phone number in case somebody wants to reach out to you?
Sure. So the website is familybusinesslegacies.com.
Okay.
Legacies is plural, Legacies. So familybusinesslegacies.com. Phone number is 317-809-3707. That's my mobile. Gets directly to me. Happy to chat.
Great. Thank you, sir.
You bet.
We were talking about needing to have the stakeholders in the room. What does your ideal client look like? Before we got on air, we were talking about 1, 2, or 3 owners, no more than 3 owners. Kind of give me a profile of what a good engagement prospect looks like to you.
Well, so it still starts with somewhat I'm going to call the revenue size, the gross revenues, right? And which I mentioned for me anyway, is 5 to 50 million. There's a part of it is 5 million seems to be, especially if they're in a cost of goods sold business of any sort, that's enough of a size to where they're not just lucky. They're actually probably pretty good at it, no matter how humble they are. I call it they've definitely got off the lucky truck a long time ago, type of a scenario. And they have the resources, technically, on a raw basis, they have the resources with which to invest to continue to grow and get better. And they've started to address some things. But most owners that are in that revenue space, they're in the industry, ideal industry space I mentioned, construction, manufacturing, distribution. All of them, then, if they kind of fit that criteria, then I'm looking at them and they're probably in the range of 45 to 65 years old. It's the ownership space that they're in. When they've attained majority ownership or more, or whole ownership, they're 45 to 65 years old, in that range. And then I kind of go even further down the line. And this, I'll tell you about this in a minute. I actually have a specific piece that I used in my first meeting. I'll come to that. But I also go in and line out, like they have generally over 10 employees and up to about 150 employees. They have a leadership team, that's involved helping them. It's not just the owner doing all things. It's not chief cook and bottle washer anymore type of a scenario. Doesn't mean they're perfect. Doesn't mean their leadership team's perfectly filled out, but they're building out and they're doing that. But they also have recognized that one day something's happened to them, to a friend, to a peer, something. One day there's an epiphany, there's a conversation that says, I'm not going to be an owner one day. I hope it's many years down the road, but even if they never say it in these words, they're going to go out horizontally or vertically, but something has caused them to be not comfortable with their plan, what it looks like, voluntary or involuntary. They're not comfortable with it, right? And so in that scenario, why that's probably got their attention is when I drill down, I say, all right, most of my owners have 60% or more of their net worth in the value of the business, which is too concentrated. It's their best investment they ever made, but it's too concentrated, just like any other advisor would say. They're more than 3/4 of their cash flow, their lifestyle, comes from the business, but more importantly, the business that they have to be there to operate, and the business is not yet ready to run without them, right? So all of those, and there's several more, but there's all of those scenarios that I actually created a one-page ideal client profile. We call it the whom we serve best sheet. And in my, if not the first meeting, although it generally is the first meeting, but it pivots to the second if we don't do it in the first, I will bring this piece out. It was done as an accidental, when of course I always say, hey, who's your target market? Well, I actually wrote up my target market. While I was doing all of that, they said, well, have you thought about turning this into a marketing piece? I'm like, no, hadn't. I just thought it was more for me. So I intentionally turned it into a front stage client-facing marketing piece to where it is part of our discussions at the very beginning. And I want them to have it. I physically give it to them at the proper time in the meeting, and it's different every time. But I give it to them because I want them to read it. I don't want to read it off the list. I want them to read it, and either they will talk themselves into or out of why they fit into that category. There is not a single client that fits every box, right? There's always going to be some boxes. But the ones I'm listening for are the ones that say, they try, and when they try to backpedal, well, this really isn't, all right, that just means they're not ready yet, right? They're not comfortable with all, that's fine, right? But everyone else that kind of resonates with it, they're looking through like, oh my gosh, yep, this is me. Yep, this is me. I'm not comfortable with this, right? Meaning they're not comfortable knowing that I can identify them, but that's the benefit is they know I can relate to them, right? I can, I met them where they are, not judgmentally, but it's just where you are. Sure. And they generally like that, right? Sure. So again, long answer to your question, but I think everybody should have a target market. But I also think if it's good enough, it should be one that's client-facing, and it allows for a relationship to build a lot faster to go forward to whatever the next steps are.
Well, and I can see where a lot of advisors would be skittish about doing that for fear that a client wouldn't fit, and they would lose a possible client over it. But the reality is, if you're focused on something and they're good clients, your time is better spent taking care of good clients.
It's a great point. And I remember when I first did this, and I kind of test piloted it with some other other peers of in my industry peers and whatever, it was the response even from those in my industry, even though they didn't necessarily do exit planning, but they at least related to the target marketing. They said, P-Ray, that's really narrow. I mean, how are you going to survive on this narrow of a space? There's just not enough companies. Well, there was nowhere near the data volume that there is today about the statistics of businesses. But back then, I mean, this is, you call it 90, right as I launched in 98, that's what I was analyzing. And so I had done, as an example, and this continues to be true today, even more so because companies have grown as far as the numbers of them. I put a pinpoint in my office. So I'm here in North Indianapolis, 96th Street in College. If you look at on a 400, Indianapolis has 465 as the loop. I'm on the north part. 12 o'clock high. I put a 50-mile radius around my office. I said, and I asked a census group, and I said, give me a list. This is before AI could probably do the same thing in a heartbeat now, right? But I said, give me a list of businesses between 4 and 20 million of revenue in construction, manufacturing, and distribution, domestically oriented, low debt. I was absolutely expecting maybe 100 companies would fit that criteria in a 50-mile radius. You want to guess how many there were?
2,000.
It was close to that. It was like 1,600 businesses.
Wow.
And at that moment, I knew.
I mean, I've done a lot of lists. So.
Well, true. Yeah, I know that's true, I guess.
Yeah.
But I think it was interesting. Even if you kind of polled the group, if they were listening and what they would guess, most would have probably guessed where I was. They would have expected really kind of a low number. So when I saw 1,600, it led me to believe and have the confidence that while everyone else thought I was going too narrow and I would starve to death, I realized I was still probably too broad. Right? I was still probably too broad because there's just way too many companies. And thus, I remember saying in 96 or 98 when I really, kind of formally launched this, I'm like, if in 20 years, in this case, almost 30 years, if I'm still the only one doing this, our industries, all these companies in the world are hurt because there's too many companies to serve, right? Yeah. You just got to find the ones that are ready. And trust me, there's a lot more ready than there were 30 years ago, not just because there's more numbers of them, but I think there's been all of the folks, all of the presence, the content, the information is very, very valuable and has gotten owners to do things and think about and plan in a way they never would have done 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I've seen several surveys recently is the age for planning has dropped precipitously. A lot of people, there's a lot of owners in their 40s and early 50s now that are concerned about planning and long range. And I think that's because they've had an example of all the boomers who didn't.
They've been shown what not to do.
Yeah.
Right. Our parents will either teach us what to do or what not to do. And sometimes it's like, if you go back to it, I should have been an absolute chain smoker with the way my parents were, but they taught me how not. Same type of thing here. So I think you're right. These younger 40 or 50-year-old owners running very successful businesses have learned from what their parents or grandparents didn't do, right? Thus, the history repeating itself until we choose to learn from it is starting to be more along the lines of we're starting to learn from it, right? And that's a good thing.
Well put. Where do you get customers from? What are your referral sources?
So a couple of different things. One is I would say is the most beneficial has been to identify I'm going to call it the local chapters of associations that represent an industry. And there's a lot of different places to search for what those are, and then especially within your city, right, or whatever market you're working in, and then work with the executive directors, if you will, of those associations to determine which one of those associations have had their members say, we want information about exit and succession planning. Please find us somebody who can speak to that at one of our annual conferences or whatever the case may be. So I literally just got back from New Orleans last Monday, speaking to the American Transportation Association. They invited me down because they remembered my speech a few years ago before COVID to an operation in Indianapolis, same type of thing. And I just got asked today to go speak to the Subcontractors Association in April, here in a couple of weeks, here in Indianapolis, again, through somebody hearing what I had done and kind of the focus and topic. So candidly to me, that is the most effective marketing, not only from getting an audience of people who are ready to listen and may want to do some things for themselves, It's also a good ROI because generally the associations are paying for all of the costs.
Yeah.
All I'm doing is showing up and giving the presentation, if you will. Right now, it takes time to develop that, but once it's developed, and I've done many of these for many years, I'm just changing the name on the front slide, if you will, and then speaking the same presentation.
Well,
That's
it's the one to many too.
It is.
There's so many people I talk to are still networking. Oh, I network. I go to all these networking events. Well, it's one to one. And, if you get one decent prospect out of an hour of networking, it's unusual. I mean, you got to go several times to get, so I agree entirely. Um, let's just wrap up here with, as you mentioned, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the number of people working with business owners on their transition was, you could count them on a couple of hands. Uh, Certainly when I started, which is not as long as you, but was 14 or 15 years ago, you still had to explain the term exit planning.
Yep.
Nowadays we have a really large number of people moving into the industry, or at least going for education and certification in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
What would be your advice? Because we get it all the time. People call us up at ExitMap and say, okay, how do I get started? What can I do? And I've got this education. I've learned what exit planning is. I've learned the vocabulary. I've learned who needs to be on the team, but how do I get started? What would be your recommendation for somebody starting out and planning for business owners as a new, I mean, it's not, has never spoken to a business owner, but it's the first time they're going to speak about this to a business owner.
I would say probably even we call it an important criteria before even saying I'm going to get the terminology down of how to address exit planning are there other components, technical knowledge that somebody is willing to and has already developed, so that they can also have coherent conversations with the other advisors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, I know I spent my time in my early part of my career from 96 forward, for the first 3 or 4 years before getting my CFBS, or Certified Family Business Specialist. I spent all the time doing a lot of extra continuing education in elements of all the different tax law. Again, not to become an attorney, right? I'm not an attorney, right? I could be an accredited estate planner. That does not make me the client's attorney, right? But it allowed me to have enough of the training to understand when I'm looking, whether it's an operating agreement, a set of bylaws, a buy-sell agreement, non-solicitation agreement, all those types of things. I could quite easily understand it, right? And also know where some issues existed with which, hey, these don't seem consistent with what your objectives are. So these advisors, are they willing to invest the time to become more technically knowledgeable outside of the scope of things that are purely exit planning, right? Or transition planning, because you're going to be talking with attorneys, and we need to have the ability to speak the same language, right? Or understand terminologies. Same thing on the tax law side. Like, what's the difference between a partnership, an S corp, a voting and non-voting, a C corp, LLCs, the different tax structures, yada yada. All those things are really relevant. Are we willing to invest those times? So I think that so if somebody's first starting out, is also be, in my opinion, to become more versed in it. You're not going to replace their accountant. You're not going to replace their attorney. And in fact, if I get a client who says, or somebody wants to become a client of mine, and they say, I hate attorneys, I hate accountants, I'm not taking them on either, right? Because I can't replace that role. I need those roles, right?
Right.
I can't become their valuation specialist, right? I've got tools that help and understand where the valuation might start, right? In anticipation of what you might expect. But I am not going to be the same tool, or what we have is not the same tool as somebody who's got the designations of a certified valuation specialist who can produce the 60-page reports, and be very, very, granularized on that one. So to begin, again, as you said, on where do you start? I would start with, if to become more knowledgeable about these other areas, start a group. And I'm not saying like a BNI type of group, but identify the other specialists that are more commonly involved and are considered key advisors to an owner. This will be attorneys, this will be accountants, this will be, sometimes, not always, bankers, as well as operational or leadership consultants. All of those things, and there's more, but those are just, I would call them the key starting points of those, and say, well, who in your area is the best at that, right? Who also markets and says, we primarily serve the same demographic, the same target market as you're trying to jump into as it relates to serving the exit planning side. Because every attorney and every accountant I talk with, they say, T-Ray, what's benefit about you is the fact that we are siloed, right? They're kind of picking on themselves. They say, we are siloed. We only do this. What you do is you make things more efficient, not only for us, as meaning the advisors, but owners do not want to pay the attorney and the accountant $400 an hour to do all of the fact finding and discovering, and some would call it quarterbacking. I like the quarterback to be the client, but sort of the head coaching, if you will, of the process. So it's finding your group, identifying your group of professionals that you can grow professionally with and refer out to have your team ready if the client doesn't already have said team, right, in place in those situations. Then look for areas to where do you become thought leader, right? What's your content you're creating? Is it a workshop like what I'm doing, or some other things to then be in the space or in the marketplace you're in to be a thought leader, so that you're recognized as advisor is this is what they do, right? The person that just introduced me to, given the speakership to the Independent Contractors Association, this is T-Ray. He is all things exit and succession planning. This is the guy, right? Here in our city, this is the guy. And so having that relationship with folks who know that's what I do and that's all I do, which is why I say be more narrow. Don't try to say, I might lose this client, so I'm going to do all things for all people. Nope. The more narrow you are, the more opportunities there exist, because people can then identify you're not just you don't sound like everybody else, to allow that to occur. So that's how I would suggest. It's a lot, I know, but that's what I would suggest.
No, it's excellent advice, and people should listen, and I appreciate it. Build your team first. All right. Well, T-Ray Phillips, thank you very much. This has been a great session, and I hope you'll come back when we ask you back. We try and go forward with specific topics as we're moving forward. As you know, we're just getting this thing back on track again after releasing 4.0 of the ExitMap, which almost ate my lunch. But
good stuff, though.
Thank you. But we'll talk to you soon.
John, thank you for having me on. I look forward to be back whenever you need me.
Appreciate it, T-Ray.
Thanks.